This audio recording is for Religious Studies 200, Religious Myths and Worldviews. I will be having a podcast conversation today with Rebecca Christian. She's a grad student at the University of Calgary in Classics and Religion. She's studying early Christianity, and she's been TAing for this course in Religious Myths and Worldviews. So one of our goals today is to retrace our steps in some of the myths that this class has looked at and try to look at some of the ideas, the ideologies, and essentially the worldviews that come out of these myths that still have some traction, still have some currency today. So, Rebecca, we're going to start with the Genesis myth from the Hebrew Bible.
Sounds good.
Chapters 1 to 3 there, and we know that there are some ideas that are going to come out of that text. What are some that might come to your mind?
Well, I find that we have an association of Genesis with very literalist readings of the Bible. So it's very easy for us to go ahead and say that the myths have no resonance unless we take a very literalist approach to the Bible, almost a fundamentalist approach to it. That's not necessarily the case, though. I find that Genesis does inform much of our discussion on gender roles, or our conceptualization of marriage.
Right.
What marriage should involve. If we look to the Bible, what does the Bible state marriage should look like?
And it doesn't say much here, but what does it say on marriage?
Well, it's certainly a heterosexual view that the marriage is between one man and one woman, and they become one flesh.
Right. Mm-hmm. So there's a sense of that hetero view that is coming out of this text that probably informs much of Western culture
Certainly.
As a foundational story.
Mm-hmm.
So we can see that this still has some traction. I mean, even in Canada, we say the movement towards same-sex marriage is only recent.
Exactly.
And had some resistance, largely from the religious communities that still see this, as you say, as a literalist, or look at it through a literalist lens.
And the Bible often comes into that discourse when we're describing marriage. It becomes an authoritative text again.
Right. Mm-hmm. So the authority of the Bible, it still has, I guess, this traction with being a book that should be followed above all others.
Certainly.
And the Bible as an authority also has some questions in mind, at least arguably, questions like how does evil come into the world? The Bible is one of these religious texts that obviously is interested in questions of meaning, and part of meaning is understanding the presence of evil. So I think in the story too, the concept of the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve being tempted by some sort of serpent figure and eventually giving in to that serpent figure. This is the introduction of free will, at least in the Christian worldview, and to a certain extent the Jewish worldview. Humans can make a choice towards evil, and this is the introduction of the potentiality and actuality of evil in the world. So it's, again, a foundational story that, if someone asks, why is there evil in the world, perhaps this story would still be read, or at least referred to, if not a literalist reading, at least symbolic, if nothing else. And as we've mentioned, Adam and Eve, probably the patriarchal or the male dominant understanding or worldview is also here. And I know, Rebecca, you've done a little bit of looking into this, that there's a couple of layers here, mm-hmm. some from the early period of Israelite history, but then some that jumps way ahead into the post-axial era, when the Talmud is being written and other interpretive works start to re-mythologize the Genesis story. So do you want to tell us a little bit about maybe the two women that are involved in this?
Certainly. It's interesting that you lead that discussion off with the problem of evil, because whenever we talk about the problem of evil or encounter what seems to be a socially very evil event, and that's what the post-axial age seems to revolve around, is reconciling these evil social events with a moral code in a way. And Genesis comes into the conversation from Christians, early Christians at the time, also from Jews who are transitioning from temple-based religiosity to rabbinic religiosity. So the rabbis later on in the post-axial period, around 300 to 600 AD, are re-mythologizing the book of Genesis. They are trying to reconcile what seems to be a gap between Genesis 1, which has a very instantaneous, calm, perfect creation between, there's the creator God and then the humans, one man, one woman, essentially are created. And then we get Genesis 2, where God creates Adam, and from Adam he creates Eve to be a partner towards Adam, and then there's a big mess when Eve bites the apple. So we have the rabbis trying to fill in this gap, wondering what went wrong between Genesis 1 or Genesis 2, or just what happened. And they propose a third party involved, the first wife of Adam, known as Lilith, which is a Mesopotamian or Babylonian word referring to a demon, like a winged demon of some sort. Now, Lilith is the absolute worst wife that Adam could possibly have been given as a first try, and notably will not submit to Adam's authority as the husband in the household. So Lilith goes off, is expelled, the first expulsion from Adam's or from the garden itself, kicked out from him, and goes on to terrorize humankind, birthing demons, eating babies, you name it. What the character of Lilith manages to do in a way is actually resurrect Eve, or bring Eve back as a pretty decent character in the discussion. Eve is not an ultimate source of evil if we bring in Lilith into the Babylonian Talmud. But some people have rejected this conception of Lilith, opposing Adam's authority in the marriage as being quite patriarchal. So this myth is in turn remythologized in contemporary settings. So what was a response to a problem the rabbis had seen in their context, now we see responses to patriarchy problems in our contexts. I know that some scholars, a feminist scholar, Judith Plasko, has created the Lilith Midrash, which is a very rabbinic way of deconstructing and negotiating the key text. And in this one, she develops Lilith as a mythic hero who liberates Eve from a system of patriarchy, who helps Eve reclaim her feminine potential. In a way. That's just one way that Lilith has been used as a re-mythologization, how an original symbol doesn't have to remain static when we look at Genesis, how we can continuously work with it and change it very legitimately from a Jewish religious perspective, particularly.
Right, and so the rabbis are in some ways using their imagination, perhaps, but they're also appealing to the Hebrew Bible itself, because I think Lilith is mentioned in the book of Isaiah.
Yes.
As a night creature or something like this, sort of a demonic environment is created. Visually, there's sort of pitch streets. There's fires always burning. It almost sounds like Mordor. It's a scary place to be, and that's Lilith. That's a tough word. Lilith's liar, and so now she is terrorizing in the views of these rabbis who gave more clarification of her role in the cosmos.
Certainly.
And her story is told a little bit by Leeming. For the students that want to double check it, it's on page 23 and 24. Well, as we've gone back to the early Genesis text, let's also go back to Hinduism and the early Vedic text. When we look at the Purusha hymn, where you have this cosmic man that is going to be sacrificed, and his body parts will become the Varnas, or the caste system, with the Brahmins or the priest as his head, the arms, the strength, the Kshatriyas, the warriors, the nobility, and then his legs, the strength of society, the merchants, and then finally his feet, the Shudras, the servants that will serve all of the above. This does remain intact in many ways until Buddhism comes along, and the Buddha, as we know, challenges the caste system, and Dharma, which used to be duty largely to the caste system or through the caste system. The Buddha, of course, redefines Dharma as teaching toward enlightenment or toward the solving of the problem of suffering. And I'm wondering what Hinduism is doing with the epics now, because one of my theories is that if Buddhism is starting to steal audience from Hinduism, starting to shake and reform the caste system, then arguably the epics could serve to retrench the caste system and Dharma. And there we have a new hero. If we talk about hero myths, we have Rama, we have Arjuna, two myths, one the Mahabharata and the other the Ramayana. And in the Ramayana in particular, you have Rama who has long flowing hair. And that strikes me because the Buddha cuts all his hair off. Why is hair so emphasized in the Ramayana? I think part of it is because, again, this is my theory, but I think because the Buddha said he was cutting his off, that the Indic value of hair as a symbol of spirituality is emphasized in the Ramayana. And it goes further. It shows how a warrior really should kill when called upon in the face of injustice or a threat to the innocent. So the epics may be remythologizing so as to re-entrench the early Varnic teaching of the hymn of Purusha. And as one follows through with this, then we get a female character by the name of Sita. And so you have Rama and Sita working together in dharmic duty, and all is well with the world by the end of the story. Or at least to a certain extent. There are a couple of parts of the story that some students, if they read the story, might think Rama's a little bit mean to Sita. But anyway, apart from that, how do you think the hetero view emerges from this, Rebecca? Because there will be the feminization of the divine that comes in stronger impulse after the epics.
I find it's interesting when we look at the Hindi epics as being a remythologization and a re-entrenching of the idea of dharma. The monastic tendency is quite strong within Hindi culture itself, and in Indian culture, it's one of those 4 stages of life. So it was probably quite attractive, the Buddha's teachings of renouncing all one's duty, one's social duty, and following a dharmic duty of monasticism and world renunciation to achieve the ultimate transcendence. This is a path that's talked about in the Upanishads quite a bit, the monastic life as being the ultimate life. Mm-hmm. Now, when we have a remythologization, that's a tricky word too, in the case of the Ramayana, and we have a marriage, a fruitful marriage being promoted, that cuts down, that negates the impact of monasticism, which is typically a celibate system. I think we can all agree with that. The importance of Sita, no matter how Rama ends up treating her rather unfortunately through it, she's still an active participant in the upholding of the Dharma that is promoted in this text. The text is quite important for the Vaishnava, I believe that's what they're called, that area of Hinduism that worships Vishnu. And Vishnu's associated as the dharmic god. So I find it interesting that Vishnu often has female consorts of Lakshmi and other goddesses that work with him as if marriage is part of following one's natural life dharma and progressing through those natural stages of Hindi life.
And when we look at the Buddha, he was a kshatriya. He came from nobility. He was a warrior. And you say that he was probably influential because he was a monastic. Certainly that's the case. These monastic, these ascetics, these sannyasins that would go out and be teachers and be world renouncers. I think the other thing that made the Buddha so appealing was that he wasn't a Shudra that was going against the caste system. The lowest rank that had everything to gain and nothing to lose.
Definitely.
He was second from the top, had lots to lose and really nothing to gain. So maybe he had more of a voice and in his culture, and as a result, the epics then re-promote the Kshatriya Rama, an avatar of Vishnu, as you say. And this is a way of remythologizing to re-entrench some of the ideas of early Hinduism. And it's highly successful. I mean, these epics now are entrenched in Hindu culture, and the Buddha is in China, in Taiwan, in Thailand, in Japan, moved out of India. And so the epics in remythologizing were successful and treasured by Hindus today.
Certainly, especially in the Mahabharata, there's so much pop culture influence and almost aesthetic promotion of that particular myth. And that scene where Krishna comes to Arjuna provides him with this theophany and really gets into his head what the upholding of Dharma really means and what it really looks like.
Right. And there's these long television series in India of the story. So we know that it still has this currency that practicing Hindus want to watch that story and they resonate with the power of the story. Rebecca, let's move into Christianity. I know that this is your area. You're studying in the first century of Christianity. Is that the right period that you're looking at?
First century, certainly. I stop at 200. So
stop at 200. So do you look at the life of Jesus at all in some of your work?
A little bit, certainly.
Okay, let's jump into that then. What's some of the high points that will feed into preserving the mythology of Jesus today, or in some cases perhaps remythologizing?
Of course. Well, we always start with the Gospels. And the Gospels are a literary genre, is something that I think is often forgotten to mention when we approach them, is that these are works of literature. And they're works meant to be mass disseminated. They were works meant to provide symbolic coherence for the life of Jesus and a symbolic narrative that the early Christian communities could follow. However, as scholarship, and this isn't just the religious community, this is the academic community as well, but as scholarship progressed, there was a tendency to look at the Gospels as providing insight to the historical Jesus. So Jesus as a historical person, whatever his mythic capabilities or miraculous capabilities were, there became quite an interest in his life as a historical man, in a way. And often it was very difficult to reconcile his performing miracles with somebody who had historical presence, somebody who lived in our own time, in our own era. We have theologians such as Bultmann, I think he's the big one, who wanted to look back at the Gospels and the New Testament and just take out all of the mythic elements, just take them out of the text entirely.
He's famous for demythologizing.
Yep, demythologization, to show that it could still resonate in Christian society. But unfortunately, as Armstrong points out several times over the course of her book, is that it doesn't really resonate the same way, and that many people find an emptiness to this reading of the foundational texts for Christianity. So there's been almost a tendency to try to reclaim these myths, not transform them in a way, but cite how they could have occurred, how the miracles would have been taken in their original context. I've read books saying that the miracles are probably the easiest thing to reconcile about Jesus's life. We don't have to believe that they occurred, but we do have to accept that his audience would have thought they were occurring.
Yeah, because even those who were hostile to him didn't say that he wasn't doing miracles.
Certainly.
They actually questioned the source of his miracles, whether it was God or Satan.
Yep.
So he did have some sway over his crowd. They actually believed in what he was doing.
Certainly the early communities, pro or anti-Jesus, as they may have been, thought the miracles were certainly what he was doing. The Son of God, that was contentious at the time, but the miracles were pretty, they thought, factual.
And one of his miracles falls in a really interesting category that is called exorcism, where he was active in... he would meet people who were possessed with demons, and he would free them from that possession. At least that's how these Gospels portray the story. And this is something interesting today. I was just a few years ago, I came across some articles in Catholicism of an increase in the training of exorcists. And then not that long ago, the movie came out, The Rite, with Anthony Hopkins. And whenever Hollywood is bringing out a movie, they're sometimes resonating with something that is actually happening. And sure enough, Catholics are more and more training exorcists. Part of the reason seems to be that there are more Christians now in the global south of the equator, than Christians in the global north of the equator. I would say in a mythology class is that Christians from the south never demythologized.
Certainly not. No.
They saw from a literalist lens, as you said earlier about Genesis, they would have seen Jesus' exorcisms as literally true, and that they still need to be done today. So here's another part of the myth story of Jesus, or the mythical narrative of Jesus, that is retaining its currency in at least the global south of Christianity and making an influence in the north. What about the book of Revelation? Do you come across that in any of your studies, Rebecca?
Not as of yet. Right now I'm focusing on the Johannine community through the Gospel of John, attributed to the same source in quotes, however, likely not the same writer by the time Revelations was written. However, even from just a pop culture perspective, Revelations has so much sway and so much influence into what we think of when we think of an apocalypse.
Yeah.
It lays out the terms for what an apocalypse is for us. The 666, the Four Horsemen.
Yeah.
Terry Pratchett does some wonderful literature playing with personifications of the symbols that the John of Revelations would have written out. And Craig was mentioning to me a little while ago about Pacific Rim.
Right.
Great movie. Had so much fun watching that. But the monsters that were just lying in wait at the bottom of the ocean, bottom from the sea, coming up to obliterate mankind.
Right. Very likely sourced out of the book of Revelation for an idea.
They had a few biblical phrases running through that.
So this idea of the end of the world, the book of Revelation really serves that interest. I don't know why humanity still has such an interest in the end of the world, but it doesn't seem that it's going to go away anytime soon.
No, there's popular young adult literature series it's based on Revelations, huge series of movies that the evangelical community promotes quite a bit.
Right.
All about the chosen people at the end, the callings, just Revelation in general.
Yeah, it's a big series. Left Behind.
Left Behind.
The Left Behind series, it must be 15, 16 volumes or more by now.
I think so. And then there's other Rapture movies or everyone's lived through at least one rapture period in their life, I think, at this point.
Yeah. And this brings us back to Jesus again, because at the center of that story is this person, Jesus, in sort of a celestial sense.
Certainly.
And that he is believed by these, the early Christians that wrote this book, that they're kind of, well, they are under an umbrella of persecution. They're hoping for the obliteration of evil, and they hope for a second coming of Jesus. Mm-hmm. So it's the end of the world. And so you talked about the four horsemen and these apocalyptic symbols, that Jesus will eventually be the ultimate warrior to destroy evil, which brings us back to the Garden of Eden. Mm-hmm. The evil will finally be destroyed. And these myths or these stories of Jesus, I think, generally are still believed to be true by most Christians.
I would say so, certainly. And I find it interesting that there is this and both connection between wanting that historical view of Jesus and wanting to know so deeply what was going on in his life and how he would have been seen in his original context. But that doesn't negate his mythic properties or the mythological elements of the story for Christian believers and for people who would define as non-Christian. We still often have the same symbols and we still recall the same biblical quotations when we're talking about the end of the world or when we're responding to some sort of insecurity about where humanity's going.
Right. And one more thing is his mother. Mary.
Yeah.
Mariology, or the study of Mary,
Mm-hmm.
Marian piety, a love or veneration for Mary that is seen actually not just in Catholicism, but also in Eastern Orthodoxy, the Eastern Orthodox Church. Mary is a very privileged saint in both traditions. And here we come back to the virgin birth of Jesus, which is a critical foundational story. And Catholics and Eastern Orthodox alike will still hold on to that one as well.
Yep. No, certainly.
And it's not just insiders, Catholics and devout Orthodox Christians, but there's even in a secular humanist country like Canada, there's still an appeal of Christmas. Now, we are demythologizing Christmas and even giving it a new name in some capacities, holiday seasons or something like Winter Festival. But Mary's not going to go away. She's here to stay in some sort of imagery because of perhaps the Christian impulse, but perhaps even more. We don't have the Shiva Shakti or the Rama Sita, but we do have male and feminine represented in son and mother.
It's interesting that she serves as a counterpart to Jesus, even though she's not his consort, certainly. She's his mother, but she still defines sort of a model for Christian and society at large to follow. Mary is the ideal woman, but she's also the ideal mother, and she's imbued with all of the things that we think of very positively towards mother figures. If Jesus becomes too esoteric, if the Christology around Jesus is too high, Christian communities go through Mary. They pray to Mary. It's a very tangible connection towards her. And we see that tangible ritualistic religiosity in Armstrong when Armstrong discusses some of the earlier myths from earlier cultures. And there's still that tendency, there's still that want to have a connection between the mythic figure or the godlike figure and the person. If Jesus is not down at our level, if Jesus is so high and so redeeming that we don't feel connected to him anymore, then certain Catholics, certain Eastern Orthodox groups promote Mary as being this go-between, as being this mediator because of her connections with motherdom and compassion.
Right. So again, very meaningful, even with the advent of science and demythologizing of the ancient stories.
Well, certainly. We're never going to not love motherliness, and we're never going to not love compassion, I certainly hope. So Mary would resonate quite strongly.
Right. Moving on to Islam, we can see that there's actually a continuity, first of all, with Judaism and Christianity. Looking at Islam as part of the Abrahamic faiths, it would claim a lineage back to the patriarch Abraham. Abraham, through Hajar, his second wife, and first son Ishmael. And you have the lineage of Islam. Now, Muhammad is in some ways going to look at the stories. Now, obviously, they're not called myths in Islam, but again, we are looking at all religions and saying we're going to use a word that we're going to be able to apply to all stories that are beyond verification. And in the case of Islam, the stories of Muhammad in some cases are considered historical, but in some cases are considered mythical, beyond verification. One of the things that the Islamic tradition does is it sees itself as correcting some of the mistakes of Torah and the Gospel. So Moses would have received a pure Torah, but later on the scribes corrupted it and actually changed some of the stories. Jesus received a pure gospel. You referred to the Gospels earlier, but then some scribes down in the 2nd century or so started to twist the words of Jesus and put words in his mouth like Son of God, or that he was worshipped, or he could forgive people from their sins, that sort of language. So Islam is not remythologizing or demythologizing, at least in its view, but it is purifying the story. And one that comes to my mind is Adam. As with all the prophets in Islam, Muslims would believe that they don't sin. And so the Garden of Eden story is interesting because did Adam sin when he ate the fruit? In the Islamic worldview, he forgot the commandment, ate the fruit, and then quickly repented and restored his submissive posture before Allah or God. And so a very different rendering of that story. And you could look at all the prophets that way. They're all redeemed in the Islamic tradition, that they're not sinning. David didn't commit adultery. Solomon didn't have all these wives. Noah didn't get drunk after the flood. You can't drink wine in Islam. And so all these myths, all these stories are purified. So there's this purification impulse in Islam that these ancient stories need to be retold with the correct understanding through Muhammad from God. And he's not just purifying stories, and he's also purifying places. And we're interested in objects and places and artifacts in this class. The Kaaba, I know that you can jump in here, Rebecca.
Okay, well, I'll let my bias flag fly here. I study place studies primarily in my degree at the moment. I'm looking into place and memory, and I'm not as familiar with the myths of Islam or the retellings of Islamic stories, but the Kaaba serves as a purified symbol. Basic knowledge about the Kaaba was it was a very important site for pre-Islamic Arabic nomadic polytheism. There were many idols in the Kaaba, many figures. Now, to Muhammad and to the tradition that becomes known as Islam later, this is a corruption, is a mistelling or a misrepresentation of what Allah's ultimate command is, and that he's the ultimate God. So by going, and we can actually historically verify that Muhammad would have gone and purified or taken the idols out of the Kaaba, they are doing a historical event, but they're also changing the social memory, correcting the social memory as to what the Kaaba represents and how the Kaaba looms within this community's mentality.
Right. When you say historical, you're thinking of 630 in the Common Era, where Mecca surrenders to him.
Certainly.
And so once he is in charge of Mecca, he's able to take away these idols. The Meccans would have called them gods, of course.
Yeah.
But he would have seen them as idols and idolatry and polytheism. So he's going to restore the purity of monotheism
Certainly.
To the Kaaba.
But when I mention it becomes more than just a historical footnote. It looms as a symbol of Islam's coming to fruition in a way, of the proper message of Allah being implemented in one specific area.
Yeah, and this Kaaba, I mean, if you think of the understanding of Islam, this goes all the way back to Adam. Mythologizing Adam, it's believed that the angels built the Kaaba, and Adam was the first worshiper at that shrine. It was destroyed, at least above its foundations, by the flood. It was restored by Abraham and Ishmael after the flood, and then it was adulterated by the Meccans sometime afterwards, and then it's Muhammad that will purify it. And so not just historical event, but very celestial ramifications, the mythological, in the sense that this is something that God wanted to have done, and therefore Muhammad is an exceptional hero in a spiritual sense, in a mythical sense, as far as the class terminology that we've been using.
Mm-hmm. When we think of mythology in Islam, the one that comes to mind almost immediately for me actually is the night journey.
Right.
Something that would be hard to historically verify. That would be difficult to put on paper as part of the historical record, but nevertheless really shapes how Islam develops, and really, as Armstrong says, it's actually the archetypal element of Islamic spirituality. There is the historical story of Muhammad's taking of Mecca and building an Islamic empire, but then there's also the spiritual element of how he gains his authority. So in the night journey, Jibril goes to Muhammad. He takes him around the holy city of Jerusalem. He takes him into the heavens. He takes him into hell. Shows him what punishments happen to the non-believers, but also shows him the paradise that awaits the believers of the system of this prophecy that Jibril is providing to Muhammad. This vests Muhammad with a huge sense of authority within the community. There's one thing to worship a message that's been told to you, but there's another thing entirely to worship from a man who has seen hell and has seen paradise and knows exactly what is awaiting this community at Mecca.
Yeah, if you're looking for a hero in your region or in your religion, what can supersede one who has been to heaven and hell and knows what the afterlife is like? And I think that's why Armstrong does say that this is the archetype. Nothing is really more powerful to bring the authority to Muhammad. And there's lots of things that did bring him authority. The surrendering of Mecca, the early battle against Mecca at Badr Wells, where 300 soldiers defeated 1,000. And again, these can be verified to a certain extent, at least with the historical writings of Islam. But nothing seems to be stronger than this night journey, where, again, there's an association with place, with Jerusalem, as you say. He travels to Jerusalem in one night, and then he sees heaven, 7 levels of heaven. He sees hell, and he's able to then tell his followers, if you follow God through my example, you will go to paradise. If you don't believe in the recitations given to me through Gabriel, then you will go to hell, because he's seen both. He's readily believed. And maybe, it's a bit of a contentious area, but one thing that does also emerge from this is something that I would refer to as the mythologizing of martyrdom. It's one thing to die in battle. It's another to believe that if you die, you will immediately be taken into paradise. But this does have traction even in the current day. Obviously, there's different representatives of Islam.
Yeah.
And moderate Islam doesn't like the way that some of the more fringe and fanatical elements are representing Islam. I don't know if they're remythologizing or reinterpreting the mythology of early Islam when it comes to the martyrdom concept, that one dies in battle and ultimately bypasses any type of judgment and goes into the presence of God. This is a type of mythology that is still believed by some in Islam today.
And it's believed in other faiths as well. It's not only Islam that has a mythologization of the martyrs. Christianity builds extensive, what we call hagiographies, or the lives of the saints. It's particularly important in Catholicism, obviously.
Right.
But we ascribe mythic elements to the saints, and we accept that their martyrdom was quick and easy reconciliation with Jesus, that it was a baptism through fire, a baptism through blood, and it gives them a very special place with Jesus in heaven. And I don't think that there would be too many contemporary Catholics who would contest this. Whether or not they chose a life of martyrdom is a hugely different area. But the idea that the martyrs do have a mythological importance reverberates in many faiths. Even in Judaism today, there's quite a debate as to Jewish martyrs and how we should be treating them. Judaism, without its own organic history or its own organic theology around martyrdom, nevertheless adopts much of the same language when talking about those who gave their lives in the Roman occupation at Masada, whether we consider those martyrs, up into people who perished in the Holocaust, whether we consider those martyrs, and if it's theologically acceptable to do so.
Yeah, the only thing I would, you're absolutely right. The only thing I would point out is the definition of martyrdom is very different from Judaism and Christianity and Islam.
Certainly.
Martyrdom in Christianity that you were talking about is dying as you witness for your faith. Martyrdom in Islam was dying as you fight alongside the prophet in the name of God. It was a different type of martyrdom. But nonetheless, you're absolutely correct in saying that different religions do have a sense of elevating the status of those who have died in the proclamation of God, whatever activity they happen to be doing at the time. Well, let's bring this to closure here, Rebecca. I'm looking at page 132 where Armstrong says, people must choose between mythology and rational science. Now, that's not her position. She's quoting Huxley. But when we look at science and mythology, the modern world, what's going to happen with mythology? Do you think there will be choosing between one or the other?
Absolutely not. I fully believe in what Armstrong is promoting, that we are myth-making people, that we're myth-making creatures in a way. And regardless of the scientific knowledge we gain, and I certainly hope there will be much more coming, let's keep the progress rolling, we're going to find different ways of discussing it. And we're going to find different devices of perpetuating it.
Right.
And one of those hugely influential and hugely resonant areas is mythology and mythological language. I know for those ecologically minded people, it's not enough to discuss Earth as being the soil and rocks that supports us, but we want to discuss her as Mother Earth, or we want to use Gaia and other elements of mythology to really hone this message that this is an organic being and this is a almost divine being that we are relating to.
Yeah, we're looking for transcendence, still looking for transcendence, still looking for meaning, still looking for heroes, still looking for reality to be more than, as you say, rocks. There's something more life-giving to the planet. So very likely most people, although there are atheists for sure, but most people are still looking for something that attempts to answer spiritual interests. Final word, Rebecca, why don't we consult Armstrong and Leeming and our own impression that we've taken away. What do you get from Armstrong? Maybe kind of a final word.
Well, a final word I get from Armstrong, and something I find that really ties into this course and shapes it, is just don't devalue myth. Let's look at myth as something that's not dead, that's not morally and intellectually bankrupt, but something that has a profound impact on how we see the world today and how we engage in our everyday activities. That's what I'm getting from Armstrong, but I also think it's very important to keep in mind when approaching other texts, when we're approaching our worldview, our conceptualizations of just those key issues, is to acknowledge that we are myth makers, we have been myth makers, and there's a whole legacy of myth that we are dealing with on an everyday basis.
Well said, well said. And I'll finish off with Leeming. He brings us into a little bit more of an analytical approach to myth, that we're more aware of types and how that those types, as we look at them, whether it's heroes, objects, places, the gods, whatever the type is, that it does strike a chord with us, that we are resonating with the search for hero, the search for place. We still have pilgrimage sites, and we still have a sense of meaning in the sacred, or what is deemed sacred at least, or something that has more power to it. And I might also add that religious studies does offer more courses, so if any students are interested, certainly look at the Classics and Religion website. So we would welcome you in the classroom anytime. And I also want to thank you, Rebecca, for assisting me with this course. It's gone really well, and I thank you for taking time to have this podcast conversation today.
Thank you.